So we're going to be talking to Jason Scarborough. He's going to join us any minute now, hopefully. How did you come across him?
Yeah, he'll jump online in a sec. So how did I come across him? I came across him through his articles initially. So Jason, we'll get him to give us a bit of a spiel on his career, but as I understand it, he used to work at the New South Wales EPA. He went out on his own and founded a small business, and he mainly does things like regulatory training for councils and that sort of thing, but also works with the private sector. And he posted a lot on LinkedIn, and I just came across some of his articles. I mentioned one in a previous pod about brand, like how our client's brand reflects on you. And more recently, and I don't think there's no issue with me saying this, I don't think it's all out there, he has been assisting The Guardian with a lot of those articles about recovered fines and recycling industry and that sort of thing. They've quoted him. He's actually featured in those articles, so I'm sure it's all fine to mention it. Yeah, he was kind of their industry source, I guess, for a lot of that information.
He's their deep throat.
Yeah, that's right. The man behind the scenes.
See, I don't read a lot of news at all. When it makes it in front of me, then it has to have hit it big time. Yeah. So the Guardian articles were rather well researched and well written.
Yeah.
Gosh, I forgot the ladies. There's two ladies there.
Yeah, I can't remember either.
Maybe we should talk to them at some stage.
Yeah.
Of all the during Mulchgate, I'm mainly referring to Mulchgate here. They did really well.
Yeah, and I mean of all the mainstream outlets, I mean The Guardian is one that has a more active interest, I think, in environmental issues.
While we're waiting for him, I have yet another question for you.
Hit me.
Give me your favorite movie and TV characters. Give me the characters that you like the most.
Let me think. Oh, there's so many good ones. In case anybody hasn't realized, I can say this, that this is your favorite show as well, Gunnar. My absolute all-time favorite TV show is Seinfeld.
Yes, I completely agree. Hence the naming convention of our podcasts.
Exactly. In case anyone didn't get that, it's a little homage to Seinfeld.
Okay, so which one? Which one of the four characters?
Which one of the four? Look, I mean, I love them all. They're all great characters. I love Kramer because he's just such a wild card, and like just the physical comedy, and he's just like, the crazy ideas and stuff. I love that. But like I identify more with Jerry as kind of like the straight guy. He's like kind of the straight guy in this kind of, but also deeply flawed himself and deeply and shallow and all those things.
I have Kramer on my list here. I also have, again, see, I could prepare for this. I have Hermione Granger from Harry Potter.
Okay.
I find her just incredibly charming, this little girl. And as you see her develop through the years. Niles Crane from Frasier.
Oh, yeah, he's interesting. Yeah, interesting character. I never really got into Frasier, I have to say.
It's these two pompous.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it.
I'm
in the middle of it again. I watch them again at the moment. Right, it's so brilliantly written.
I got another one I think you'll like. One of my favorite complex characters on TV, Walter White.
Funny you say, because I have two others out of Breaking Bad on my list. Gus Fring. It's amazing. So there's this ruthless, killing drug lord, and yet he manages to come across as someone you really want to be in business with.
Yeah.
It's such a great character. And Mike Ehrmantraut, do you know him, the security guard, the security guy that he hires?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was great. I mean, yeah, I say Walter White only because like he's one of my favorite characters I've seen on TV because of the evolution.
Yeah.
And I mean, anyone who hasn't watched Breaking Bad, go and watch it because it honestly is one of the best series that's ever been on TV, I think. There's his evolution from like a normal guy who does something that he believes he has to do to survive, and his evolution into something completely different in the end, and his motivations, how they change over. I just think it's super interesting and like really loved it.
I'll let Jason in. We can continue. We can ask him.
We should.
Let me get him in.
How's that?
Hey, that's
very good.
There we go.
Jason, we have an attack on you already before we even start.
It's a friendly attack. It's a friendly attack.
Yeah.
We were just about to talk about favorite TV and movie characters. So not someone to play you or that you identify with, but which characters do you think are just brilliant on TV or in movies?
Look, I'm going to tap into my dark side here. I'm a big fan of, I don't know if you know the series The Boys. It's sort of like a alternate take on superheroes.
No, of it. Haven't seen it yet, but no, but I've heard a lot of my friends watch it and they love it.
Yeah. There's a character in there called Billy Butcher, and I think he's the culmination of everyone's sort of dark side, if you like, and the sort of things that people dare not tap into. So yeah, I find that character very interesting.
A couple of examples that we talked about. Like one of them was Walter White. I think we're drawn to portrayals of the darker side of humanity that people try and keep out of the light a lot of the time. But
hey, speak for yourself. I picked Hermione Granger.
that's true.
Oh, okay.
And sorry, Jason, we'll kind of sorry to drop that on you.
No, it's all good.
You know what Gunnar and I, what we're all about. We don't really do we just kind of jump online and we do this and we do these recordings, and we've just been thinking about, I guess like bringing a bit more of the personal side of things to these recordings and for our guests as well.
Yeah.
So what would be great? I sort of gave a bit of my understanding, I guess, of your background, but you'll do a way better job than I can. So maybe could you start with just giving us a bit of your career history?
Look, I suppose my venture into the environmental sector was probably a little bit unconventional in that I desperately wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. I basically was heading down that path. I got pre-accepted into the Defence Force Academy to do engineering, so happy days. But it required all sorts of physical and psychometric testing and all that sort of business, which I aced up until the very last test, which was a colour perception test. And I had no idea that I had severe colour blindness.
Oh, wow.
So that ruled me out of being an engineer, with the Air Force at least. A good mate of mine that I was at high school with, he said, come and do environmental science. And I said, I like science and it aligns sort of closely with, what I've been studying. So, that's not a bad idea. But the seller was more than 50% of the class is female. And I was like, okay, that sounds like good gigs.
Look, hang on. So you go from Top Gun to Aaron Brockovich.
yeah, pretty much, yeah. So studied that, loved it. Started in private consultancy, doing a lot of contaminated land work. So, up your alley. So primarily service station and fuel depot sites when they were going through that big sort of rationalisation of numbers. So, did a lot of regional New South Wales. Then worked for local government for a few years, and like all good local government positions, I suppose I got hired as the environmental officer, and then somehow managed ending up looking after the landfill, the collection systems, the recycling, and how those jobs evolve. And then an opportunity came up at the EPA, which I spent the best part of 20 years at, mostly in either regional ops or waste compliance.
You would have seen a lot in 20 years of the EPA.
I remember an old bloke I used to work with. He say, if you're here long enough, you'll see things go in cycles. And I was there long enough to see things go in cycles. So
I won't name the name, but I know I go back into the 1990s. But one of the senior EPA guys there, I spoke to him one day because he left, and I said, "What happened? Why did you go?" And he says, "Do you know the show Yes Minister?" Right? And I said, yeah, okay. He says, I did not want to be part of that anymore.
I know one of the biggest talking points there was like when Utopia started, everyone was sort of talking about how very close to home it was, with a lot of the stuff that we were doing. But anyway,
You saw a lot. You were there for 20 years. You had a long stint at the EPA, and then when did you step out on your own?
4.5 years ago now. We offered a lot of online skills development during that period, which people seemed to love because they had regulatory officers sitting around at home staring at the wall. What better time to develop some skills?
So what sort of services were you offering and are you offering now?
So definitely the skills, the regulatory officer skills development side of things. The coin that I like to use when talking about it has how to efficiently, effectively, and ethically apply powers that regulatory officers are given. So the first two are usually big sellers. The third one is a bit of a tough take up sometimes.
Yeah, right.
Because it's just seen something that is either not covered fully or neglected a little bit.
That's the ethical part of it.
Yeah. And when I say ethical, I don't mean necessarily like straight out corrupt, but
Yeah.
things like using a bit of empathy in the decision making as well.
Yeah.
Being
And
more on the outcome rather than, some sort of punishment or
punishment.
retribution.
Retribution is a good word. Yeah.
Give me those three again, please, Jason.
Yeah. So effective, efficient, and ethical.
You should have stayed at the EPA. That sounds like something they could come up with.
Yeah. Look, it was definitely something that I don't know, and I don't like speaking badly of someone that an employer that took up 20 years of my life, but it does seem something that is sort of drifted a little bit out of the thinking.
Yeah.
Towards the end of my time there was, and I don't know if that's an experience thing or just a cultural shift thing or a generational shift thing.
Yeah.
But there seem to be fewer and fewer officers of the mindset of, look, let's sit down and talk with our licensee or the operator and work our way through to a solution.
That is something that is not unique to public service. That is not unique to the EPA. It is that kind of move towards tick box assessments rather than talking things through, individual assessments, individualizing of decisions. That has changed in the last, especially I would say in the last 15, 20 years. That is not unique to the EPA. That's not unique to anyone.
Yeah.
Even in private enterprise, I notice a lot of it has gone away from individual thinking and applying individual decisions towards and here it is, of course, a very accountable process that is then much, much easier to defend rather than saying, well, I know that person that I hired, I thought she was just a perfect fit for the team. I can't really tell you why.
It's like less discretion, isn't it? Less discretion across the board. And I think I was talking about your articles in the lead up, and how much I enjoy reading your articles. And I find that some of the insights that you have in those articles on your website, they're insights that I don't see elsewhere in the industry. And I think that they're really interesting issues that you talk about.
Oh, thanks.
We should start with recovered fines. We've kind of talked about recovered fines a bit to death on the podcast already, but it's just it's a hot issue, and I see recovered fines as a bit of a gateway to the whole resource recovery framework. Yeah, one of the more interesting and controversial RROs that are out there. Correct me if I'm wrong. You worked on the original fines order?
No, not on the actual order, but on a compliance program not long after the initial order was given or issued.
I'm so sorry. I need to step in. Can someone please explain what recovered fines are?
Jason, please.
Yeah. So look, the definition in the order is basically anything that comes out of a mixed skip bin that's less than 9.5 millimeters in size. It could be soil, it could be fragments of, plasterboard, small bits of timber.
It's kind of a loamy. So when I say loamy, it's kind of like a fluffy soil material. It's pretty. It's not very dense. It's typically meant for like surface application. Is that right?
Yeah. Look, fluffy, I think, is the perfect description of the texture of it.
Yeah, it's like a topsoil type material.
How much of this gets produced every year in Sydney?
See, this is the thing, Gunnar. There isn't like a real accurate handle on how much is actually being produced. The best estimates is that it's somewhere in the vicinity of 700,000 tons a year.
Ooh, wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah. My God.
But that could be plus or minus 50%. So the data's really good in terms of what comes into facilities. What comes out, not so much.
All right. So what's the problem with recovered fines? Why are we constantly talking about them?
Well, because it's that fine residue of anything that end up in the skip bin, particularly if we're talking about demolition sites. You could have things like asbestos. You could also have things like lead from lead-based paints. There is also a whole variety of other substances like, former treatment chemicals used for termites, which hang around a long time in soils and are ecotoxic by accumulating. It has risks. That's probably the best way to describe it.
Sure. But sure enough, we test for that.
Oh, yeah. There is testing, but except for asbestos. Yeah. There's just a blanket prohibition in terms of the recovered fines aren't meant to contain asbestos, but there is actually no requirement in the order to test for it.
We've been through 3 reviews, right? So you said you were working on the initial review, and then there was a review in so there was one in 2014.
Yep.
2019, I think.
19. Yep.
And then there's just been one just now, end of 2023. So but from what I can see, the findings from those reviews are all pretty much the same, but I can't see why we're still having the same issues now as we were having back in 2014. But
I can definitely talk to the 2013 exercise that was undertaken. And look, as soon as we started looking into it, identifying sort of issues all over the place, particularly in terms of control of input materials. Well, because of what goes into a skip bin can be so variable, the output materials were so variable. So in other words, probably a great example of this, we went to a facility to take some samples at Maroubra. And of course, the material there looked very sandy. Went to a facility further out west towards Penrith, and it was more of a loamy sort of material. Still had a lot of the same inclusions. It's just extremely variable. So in terms of being able to, I suppose, apply a blanket framework over the top of that, there was going to be a problem right from the start.
Right.
What do recovered fines get used for? So because, so you have a skip bin, it goes into a recycling facility, the timber and the walls and the bricks get taken out.
Yep.
And the little stuff that is on the bottom that accumulates goes through a sieving process and the processing process and gets tested in accordance with the resource recovery order. And then we have a product. Where does that product end up?
From the information we had at the time, the main use was being in turf underlay, basically leveling off, building sites, infrastructure sites, smoothing them out before that layer of turf went on top. Garden beds, we'd often see the material ending up in, garden beds, again, in infrastructure or, unit developments and the like. It's also been used as direct landscaping material. The things that it says it can't be used for is things like quarry backfills and all that sort of stuff. But just because something says you can't do it on paper doesn't mean it doesn't happen in reality.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I think that, quarry rehabilitation would seem to be a perfect use for something like this that has fluctuating, levels of quality.
Yeah, like on a managed site, it would probably not be a bad solution.
And I mentioned, your input to a lot of the Guardian articles. So that's been pretty well publicised. And Gunnar and I, have said before, we quite like the level of investigative journalism that went into those articles. And, I didn't necessarily agree with the angle of all the articles, but I think that the work, like the factual basis of them was good. And so what I was going to ask about is, just the sampling regime, because that appears to have been an issue throughout all the several reviews, where this idea of continuously producing this material and sampling it on a kind of a once a week basis or whatever it might be, that concept is an issue now, but it seems to be an issue in the past. Is there anything you could say about why continuous processing was still allowed?
James, I don't know. It's to be honest. Look, it's probably the best parallel I can draw to it, and this might not be this. I don't mean to alarm your listeners, but this might be something they may be aware of. There's a system that involves the testing of pesticide residues in food. So basically, food goes to the markets, people go and sample it, and it goes away and gets tested. Now, the same food then gets on-sold to supermarkets, whatever, bought by the customers, and then the results come back. And the results might say, oh, yeah, those strawberries were actually had in excess of the maximum health levels of chlorpyrifos on them. And then you got to go through this exercise of who sold them to who and what store do they end up. It's too late.
Unreal.
The continuous process recovered fines was a lot like that, because a lot of these processing sites are very constrained for space. They don't have the capacity to store this material, until they get the test results to release it. And it can take up to 2 weeks, depending on how busy the labs are. And then, if they get a result that says, this samples for recovered fines well and truly exceeded the thresholds for lead. Well, if it's gone to a landscape supply store, you got Buckley's of figuring out where it's gone from there.
So it's interesting. Okay, so there's parallels in other industries, I guess, of that same sort of method. You've just won an argument for my wife, Jason.
Yeah.
I did not know that, and it's amazing. I I'm always intrigued, like when you find about the kind of like behind the scenes of other industries and things that assumptions that you have about them that prove to be wrong. My wife is always on me about washing strawberries.
Oh, yes.
And I'm always like, no, don't worry about it. It's fine. It's fine. I'm going to wash all my strawberries now. So there you go.
Can I ask, do pesticides come off when you wash them? I mean, that's another question we should ask.
Yeah, look, some do, some don't. Depends on the nature of it, how it acts. Some of them actually gets absorbed into the leaves and the flesh of the fruit, whereas others just sit on the surface. So.
Yeah, the reason that there's a need, I guess, for recovered fines is like, so say the EPA canned the order tomorrow and you couldn't use recovered fines at all anymore. There's two issues about that. As far as I can see it, is that there's all that material would then go to landfill, and we've got an episode coming out soon that talks about the looming crisis around landfill space, but also that 700,000 tons or so that goes on to infrastructure jobs and what have you as a kind of a topsoil or soil replacement has to come from somewhere else. So you're talking about massive use of natural resources, massive carbon in transporting them from elsewhere, that sort of thing. So like, is there a role for this material going forward? Like, what's your opinion on that?
Look, I definitely think there's a role for it going forward, but I think it needs to be commensurate with the risk that potentially poses. So I sort of alluded to before, if you're talking about controlled and managed sites, so mine and quarry rehabilitation, using it as cover at landfill sites and things like that, I'd be thinking, because even in those situations, particularly for a landfill site that has like leachate collection, if a batch of material goes out there and it had higher than allowable concentrations of lead, well, it's in theory a closed system. So the environmental risk of that is a lot lower than, say, a newly developed parkland somewhere. So.
Yeah, this might kind of bring us into the next point that we had, which is about the resource recovery framework review. In my dealings with the EPA around resource recovery orders, there seems to be a view that because it can be hard to control the end use sites in some cases, that there's not much of a willingness to go above like a very conservative low level of contamination. For recovered fines to be viable, you have to accept that they are going to have fluctuating quality, and
yes,
and on average they are probably going to be at the higher end, potentially above like residential contamination thresholds. The review, I believe, is looking at how do we open up new options for resource recovery use and how that might be managed. Do you have a view on like how that might be achieved through a new system? Well,
yeah, that's an interesting topic, James, and one I know I've bored my friends with ad nauseum about.
Well, because, please,
yeah,
that's what we're all about. We're boring my friends.
Lay it on us.
I like to always take a step back. Okay, let's look at a waste facility operation, for example. The environmental compliance aspects is not the only thing they've got to worry about. They've got a trucking fleet that has its own set of compliance requirements for that. They've got, workers that have compliance requirements, not just with worker health and safety, but payroll. So you've got a mass of compliance and red tape stuff that sits over the top of those operations. I've always been of the view that you should be making regulation as simple as possible to achieve the outcome that you want. And I've always sort of held the view that the resource recovery framework was an unnecessarily complex system.
Right.
That just added layers of complexity to particularly waste operators' business.
Right.
And I think in many cases unnecessarily. So you've got the general orders and exemptions.
Mm-hmm.
I forget how long the list is now at the moment. But there are literally hundreds of specific exemptions.
Yeah.
So just the complexity from a regulatory point of view and administering that is huge.
Yeah. And if I could just jump in on that, one of my pet peeves, I guess, is around inconsistency in the way things are applied. And I think that any of our listeners who haven't dealt with the resource recovery framework system, I agree with you. I think it's quite complex. Like you said, there's a set of general orders that are available for anyone to use that are on the website. What you're referring to there is that there are hundreds of specific resource recovery orders that are issued for particular sites or particular entities, and they are completely private. It's actually not possible to get copies even through a GIPA process from the EPA because they're commercial in confidence. It's a very opaque system.
Mm.
I like transparency when it comes to governance and the public service. And so that is a major issue for me as well.
I agree. And that was something that never sat right with me, particularly when you're co-regulating a lot of these issues with local government.
Yeah.
They show up to a site where someone's spreading, weird muck on agricultural land.
Yeah.
And they could go away and potentially do a whole investigation and not realise that it's actually lawful because there's this order that you're not allowed to access.
Wow. I didn't even think about that. Like, yeah, working between regulators, they wouldn't even have the same access. So do you have a kind of a model that you would suggest as a replacement?
Yeah, look, to be honest, I think it already exists. I mean, the biosolids guidelines contains this framework, and I suppose for those that don't know the terminology, biosolids is basically the new word for sewage sludge.
Yeah.
So it contains a framework where it basically says, test the material for these key contaminants, assess the soil that you're looking to apply it on for the same contaminants. Here are your maximum allowable soil levels. Now go away and work out an application rate that doesn't exceed that.
Mm.
And I can't see why you can't apply that to nearly every type of waste that you're looking to land apply for agricultural purposes. Now, I think that process is, it's scientific, it's robust, it's repeatable, and it is something that if something untoward happens, you can go back and audit and see, has it fallen down somewhere?
Would the same approach apply for like industrial engineering applications, or would it need to be different?
Well, look, I think they're, again, probably more of an outcome focus, again, rather than a prescription sort of focus in terms of, okay, you want to use it as fill on, mine rehab, here are your threshold levels. You want to use it as topsoil replacement material in public open space, well, those levels are probably a bit lower. I think this process of having separate exemptions and orders for specific waste types, it's just going to increase in complexity and generate that more inconsistency that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So if I understand you correctly, you would suggest that we change it from the source where we currently assess waste at the source and say, this is the type of waste we are generating. You would say, forget about that. We need to go to the end point and say, we are going to apply a waste product on this site. As a result, that we have certain criteria for this site, certain access criteria, certain risk criteria, certain land uses. And as long as your waste meets those, it can be applied. Am I right here? Am I interpreting that correctly? You are saying, okay, let's go to the end point and say, there's guidelines for the endpoint.
Yeah.
And as soon as your waste meets those criteria, you can apply them.
You can apply it. Yeah. That's the thinking. Yeah. So being that more sort of outcome focus, and without telling tales out of school, I do actually have a real life example of this with one of my clients who invested a lot of time and money in a composting process. And they did a lot of research, and they actually come up with a recipe where they could put septic tank waste into this composting process. I won't divulge the full process, but basically it comes out the other end, Australian standard for pathogen control, contaminants, the whole box and dice.
Yeah, nice.
But because the compost order doesn't specify that you can use septic tank waste, and this is the bad news I had to break to him, he can't use that compost under that order. He'd have to apply for a specific order and exemption to do that. And he's been told pretty well flat out that won't happen because of the input material he's looking at.
Let's take a step back and think about what we're trying to achieve here. We're trying to reuse as much material as we can. We're trying to avoid things being disposed of unnecessarily.
Yeah.
And we're talking about innovation. Like the EPA, the team that does this has innovation in its name. The fact that there's a process that somebody has invested heavily in and can demonstrate works that has no chance of getting approved. It's something's wrong there.
Something's wrong. Yeah. And I think that's the key word, James, innovation. And in my experience, that outcome focused approach always fosters that innovation.
Yeah.
Because if it doesn't matter how you get to the finish line, the creative process can take over and smart people come up with great ideas.
If we push ahead with that approach, that is an earth-shattering change.
It's tearing up the existing system, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's tearing up everything.
Yeah.
And you would not only tear up existing multi-million-dollar operations, you would tear up the knowledge base of regulators who are enforcing those at the moment. They would have to be completely retrained and realigned in that.
Yeah.
And it's the same not only with industry, with regulators, but also there would have to be a shift in the market to accept those kind of products. So I hate to tell you, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, it sounds to me sort of like a shift around the same magnitude of going to a circular economy.
Yeah.
And I'll be completely honest with you, that's the thing that probably disappointed me the most about that independent review. Was the terms of reference specifically said, look at the existing system.
Yes. Yeah, it was very constrained, wasn't
it? Yeah.
Like it couldn't even consider whether the framework itself structurally was not fit for purpose anymore.
Exactly, yeah.
It was always going to be a bit disappointing, I think, what it came out with.
So considering that a tectonic shift like that, there's so many reasons why this is not going to happen, right? Even if everybody says, let's do it, but the regulator will be scared of a huge backlash from the public, because people don't like change. Let's face it. And this is not a little bit. This is a fundamental change in an industry that is highly emotional, extremely easy to politicize. I can already see some politicians saying, okay, I mean, no shit-based waste in my electorate. I can see that coming, right?
Yeah.
It's like, and you will instantly have a whole lot of voters on your end because people don't want to look into the resource recovery framework, because who wants to? I mean, I'm already getting bored here on my own podcast. So,
I mean, and Jason, I think, like Gunnar and I are all for tearing up the book. We're all for it. Like our episode last week was all about totally different approach to sampling. So like, we're for it. I think that, Gunnar is definitely being a realist, I guess, about it. And I mean, did you deal much with transitional arrangements? Like, I agree with you, Gunnar. I think it is extremely hard. I think that with leadership, it can be done. I do think that you're right in that, like, a whole industry is built around an existing framework. And if you're going to change it to something, there has to be a transitional period.
Oh, yeah.
Like, did you deal much with, I don't know if you dealt with MWU much, Jason, like any other kind of transitional, sorry, that's another acronym, mixed waste organic outputs. Do you have a view on like transition, like how industry could be supported?
Look, I think the model's already there. In terms of, that sort of transition, maybe I'm the eternal optimist, but I can see in my mind's eye it probably wouldn't be that complex in terms of, just telegraphing ahead of time, okay, we're shifting away from inputs and sampling results, and we're now going to outcome-based use to align with the circular economy program. And to say, as I was saying before, industrial land use, here are your sort of levels, residential, here are your sort of levels. Look, I think the market will probably take care of a lot of that, because obviously you would be getting a premium for material that met those residential standards. Because that's the other, look, sorry, I'm jumping around a bit, but that's the other thing I think a lot of people don't appreciate. The economic value of recovered fines at best is $0 a tonne.
Yeah.
Hang on. Recovered fines, how much do they go per tonne, James?
For disposal, yeah, Jason's right. I mean...
No. If I want to buy them.
You will typically either pay nothing for them or get paid to take them in the order of $15 to $25 a tonne or so.
Okay.
We could keep going on about this. So maybe we can go to the third point we had. Only because, so for anyone who's interested, we'll put a link to the resource recovery order framework review and everything that's come from that. Like, the EPA has responded to the recommendations of the review, and there's a delivery plan. I don't think there's been a whole lot of progress on the delivery plan, but the third point we wanted to talk about is actually something that is currently open for comment. So I think we'll try and get this put out next week. The New South Wales Chief Scientist review of asbestos and resource recovered material, it's open for comment until the 31st of July. And so I think that might be something that's relevant for our listeners to jump onto and have a bit of a look. So there's a discussion paper about prompting responses from people rather than kind of giving any direction as to what they're going to say. I don't know, have you had a chance to have a look at that at all, Jason?
Oh, had a chance to look at it, even made my submission. So yeah.
Oh, good stuff. Well, do you want to tell us what some of your thoughts were?
Yeah, the first ones is that they're saying, well, what should we consider if we're talking about thresholds or screening levels for asbestos in recovered fines or other materials that have been beneficially reused. Now, again, I suppose I've taken a step back there and said, look, there's a problem right from the start with the legislative framework, in that the objects of the Protection of the Environment Operations Act says that it's there to protect, restore and enhance the environment of New South Wales. Now, to walk a requirement backwards would seem to run contrary. And I've heard your discussions about, zero thresholds and how scientifically ridiculous they are. And this is where science and politics sort of clash a bit.
Yeah.
Setting, because I can see politically people would have problems with that in terms of relaxing that current zero threshold based on that objective.
I think it would be seen as a relaxing or like a loosening of restrictions around asbestos use. Like, even though that's what happens in WA and all this sort of thing, but
that political issue is probably going to have to be addressed first before, we start talking about the science of you, me, and your other informed listeners there know that we, breathe in asbestos fibres all day, every day.
I think in principle, most people would agree that not having asbestos in recycled products is the goal.
Yes.
I guess, I think where we all get hung up is how do you practically demonstrate that something doesn't have asbestos in it in a scientific and practical way?
Yeah, and that was covered, in the questions in the review as well. And, I was completely honest in my response and saying, look, to try and do that at the waste facility, to try and identify every single fibre is an exercise in futility. It's just not going to happen. So we know where this stuff is coming from. It's buildings and constructions that were completed prior to the 1st of January 2004. They're the things that could contain asbestos containing material. So we can readily identify sources. It's just there's this real fragmented regulatory approach to dealing with that material at source.
Yeah, the industry talks about this a lot, where a lot of the onus of this stuff is put on recyclers, and recyclers are actually in the middle of the supply chain, and there hasn't been a lot of work on pushing the responsibility further up the supply chain to the places that are actually generating the material.
You want to push the onus onto the for example, the demolition contractor?
It sounds like we've dealt with similar demolition contractors in terms of their I suppose ability and willingness to identify this material sometimes. But I think the regulatory approach could be streamlined and integrated to provide a better outcome. I mean, a classic example is at the moment, if someone does a bathroom reno by themselves, like DIY, as long as it's less than the 10 square metres, it's local government's responsibility to regulate that. As soon as they go over the 10 square metres, or if they hire a contractor to do it, becomes SafeWorks' responsibility to regulate that. But depending on who's doing it and if they're paying someone to do it, you've got two different regulators right off the bat.
Can I ask you a question that may be controversial? Do you think the waste levy on asbestos waste should be scrapped?
Oh, I'll give you a definitive answer. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The intent of the waste levy, I mean, if you go back to the origins of it, was to economically incentivize resource recovery and recycling. Yeah. You cannot do anything with asbestos other than put it in a landfill.
Yeah.
So it should not be subject to the levy. I don't know if I can be more definitive than that.
We talked, if anyone hasn't listened to that pod a couple back about the Barrel landfill, we talk about the waste levy a bit in that and explain how it works. But I would almost say that people should be allowed to take asbestos to a landfill for free, and the landfill should just be compensated by the state government for taking it.
Well, I did an interesting exercise at the waste conference a little while ago, and I asked the question, is the lawful disposal of asbestos waste sufficiently incentivised? Have a guess how many out of 40 people said yes.
What do you reckon, Gunnar?
None.
Yeah, zero.
Yeah.
See, this is the thing. Our industry, sorry if I say our industry, okay, I'm chucking everybody into one bucket here. But everybody on the consulting side knows exactly what's going on. Nobody ever who I spoke to was surprised that we found asbestos in mulch. It's like it was an obvious thing that had to come out at some stage. It then turned into these comedy capers that we were all watching, where everybody ran for cover while the environmental consultants had a field day laughing about this.
Yeah.
It was the epitome of insanity of what happened. And what should have happened is a review of, hey, how did this happen? Maybe we have some regulation that maybe doesn't make any sense at all. Let's change that. No. We don't know. We don't go that way. We got to go completely the other way and make it even worse. I mean, it's okay. That's the end of my rant for this podcast, right?
You have to have at least one rant per pod.
There's one rant, yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't think I'm talking out of school either, but like in private conversations or, workshops with the EPA around that question of like, should we just scrap the levy on asbestos? The argument that I've always heard put forward for not doing it is that it will create a perverse incentive for people to contaminate other waste streams with asbestos so they can dispose of those other waste streams for free.
Yeah.
I just shake my head and think, yeah, okay, that might happen, but there are so many ways you could control and minimize the risk of that happening. And the ways that you do that are no more difficult than what we're currently doing to try and deal with asbestos waste. Like,
for actually removed sheets that are appropriately wrapped, that shouldn't be a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, for things like asbestos contaminated soil, and I know Queensland had some experience of this with the levy. They did have a couple of incidents of people, I like to call like lightly seasoning the soil with
a little sprinkle.
Yeah. And so they shut that down. They said, we're just doing the wrapped sheeting, bagged fibers. We'll do that levy free. If you bring soil in that's contaminated, that's still subject to the levy. Look, I don't think that's a bad approach because it does incentivize that sort of upfront removal.
Yeah.
The flip side is that, if you come across legacy contamination.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying there, and I understand why Queensland would have made that decision. Like my view, tell me what you think, Gunnar. This is more a contempt sites thing. I reckon that 9 times out of 10, there are ways where you could do the work, say early on in a project or whatever, to identify whether it was there. You know what I mean? And kind of establish that early on. How much of a risk do you reckon it is that people do that?
It's not that easy to say, has this fragment been in that soil for 10 years or 10 days? That's not that easy.
Yeah.
I think the solution to it all would be, and we've spoken about it, how difficult asbestos is to regulate because it's such an emotional issue. And backtracking anything would be considered more risk to the environment, more risk to people, although that's not the case. We need to somehow manage to merge the waste legislation with the contaminated land management legislation. So in other words, we shouldn't treat asbestos differently, whether it is in a waste product or whether it is in soil on a kindergarten. And that would be probably the way to get this done. When we say, no, we are not relaxing the legislation at all. We are just bringing them in alignment, the two of them, because ultimately the soil that is perfectly acceptable to be in a public park is perfectly acceptable to be in a public park. End of the discussion. We have ways of determining that. That's settled science. That is settled methodology. We can fine-tune them, but ultimately that's what we do. And we throw all that out the moment we go into the waste legislation, the moment we remove that material from a public park where it was perfectly sitting there, no problem, no risk, everything assessed, all good, and we remove it, it becomes asbestos waste. There is a problem. And the way to resolve all that is you need to bring them both into a risk-based decision matrix. How much risk is there, not how much asbestos is there. Nobody has a problem that there is a certain amount of lead in the garden soil that I buy from my garden center. Not because it's contaminated, but hey, guess what? Just because it's there. Nobody has a problem with this. We need to get the stigma away from the asbestos, because why do we treat asbestos differently than any other contaminant? The solution would you merge the two legislations into the risk-based one, into the science-based one, and not into the, I don't even have a word for it, but into the emotional one, and which is a clear mistake in the legislation. The definition of asbestos waste is not only scientific nonsense, it is economic nonsense. It is a clear mistake. That interpretation of the appeals court is a mistake.
Yeah.
Can someone please change that?
I do just want to know, because you haven't said this on the podcast before, is that like the standard for material imported to Australia to be considered as asbestos free or free of asbestos is 0.01% by weight.
It's not zero.
It's not zero. So let's just be all clear, right? There are products on the shelf at the shops that may contain more than 0 asbestos, but they are certified as being asbestos free. Unfortunately, the same does not apply to recycled product. There's so many issues around it and like the communication about it and that sort of thing. I do note, just going back to the chief scientist's discussion paper, that one of the final points is around like a risk-based.
Yeah, no, I'm all for it. When you break it down, you know where the legacy asbestos containing material is.
Yeah.
It's in pipes, which are underground, which you can manage if they're decommissioned, in that case anyway. And it's in building materials.
Yeah.
Again, why are we making this process so unnecessary complex in terms of, right, we know where our high-risk material is. Let's create a process that makes it easier for whoever's doing it, be it a DIYer or a licensed contractor, take the time and effort to remove that material properly, dispose of it appropriately. That remaining material can then go to a waste facility free of asbestos. Like, as long as obviously you've got, certifiers signing off on the process as well. It almost negates the need for any sort of screening and testing at the facility, which everyone agrees is futile because it's never going to intercept everything that comes in the gate.
That's great. You've got your submission in. I need to get my act together and get mine in. Anyone who's interested, who's listening, you've got until the 31st of July. We'll put the link in the show notes. So go check out the paper. It is actually very important. And so we run over time. We always do this because we enjoy talking about this, to our guests so much. I really do think, Jason, like I said, there's many other articles I've read on your website. I think just other perspectives on other issues that are totally different to what we talked about today that I would like to maybe revisit down the track if you're open to that. We might just wrap it up there, but thanks again for your time.
No worries, James. No, thanks, Gunnar.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, Jason. Bye.
Bye.